Good morning, guys. Well, I went out yesterday to the shop and I went into a local charity shop and I found this book amongst all the Dan Brown and the Patricia Cornwall. Just a little old book. I had to fix the cover because it's broken. It's called Storming Heaven and it's by a guy called Ralph Fox. So I had a little look. I thought it was quite an interesting cover. It's got like shocked looking angels and aeroplanes and some technology and a sort of a bit of chaos and unhappy religious types. So I had a little look in the cover, and this guy Ralph Fox also wrote a book called People of the Steppes, and it's about Russia. Although this book of exceedingly interesting adventures, there's also something more. So I thought, oh, keep going. It was 7 shillings and sixpence when it was made, published. Xmas 1931, so it was given to somebody for Christmas. It was printed in 1928. It's in 2 parts: the Pacific East Coast, the Pacific West Coast, Asia, then Book 2, The New Land, Part 1, Black Earth, Part 2, The Chinese Wall. It's a novel. So the author's note, I won't read all of it. The political divisions of the former Russian Empire were in 1922 a little complicated. The eastern provinces of Siberia, between Lake Baikal and the Pacific, were then an independent democratic republic. So the novel's about this guy called John, and John was an orphan who was brought up into, I don't know, a youngish age in a seaman's mission. And then he was adopted, but he had this urge to travel and he ended up in Russia. So this is pretty much what the actual author, Ralph Fox, did. He ended up in Russia, but we'll have a look at some information about him afterwards. But this is the bit that got me interested in the book. Readers who are not ethnologists must not be confused by constant references to Turkish speech and Turkish peoples into thinking that the Bolsheviks, already accused of so many crimes, have also annexed the Turkish Republic. Such an action would hardly have passed unnoticed by Lord Birkenhead and Mr. Winston Churchill. No, the truth is that the majority of those inhabitants of Asiatic Russia, generally loosely referred to as Mongols or Tartars, are neither but the ancient nucleus of that great Turkish race, of whom the Osmanlis themselves are but an impure branch. London, June 26, 1927. I thought, oh, Tartars have been mentioned. So I had a bit of a read. So this guy was in his 20s when he wrote this book, and he married and lived in Russia and stayed in Russia. I think he got killed in the Spanish Civil War, and it's quite flowery in its writing, and I just was like going through. I had to look at the second part first. So what he does is, he actually is in this place in Russia, up on the steppes, and he commits a real faux pas. He takes a dog into a church and everybody goes crazy. They're really, you know, he's like not very, the locals aren't at all happy about the fact that he's taken this dog into the church. So he goes off to see the priest, and he's already apologised to the priest, and the priest talks to him about he said, we say the Tsar and God, and you say the King and God, and all this sort of like philosophical stuff. And he gets drunk with the priest, and the priest says this to him. So John says to him, "Is it true that there is a village of Mormons not far from here?" "Quite true," the priest answered, as he placed a bottle of fiery Samangogka on the table. The village of Logachovka, 30 versts from here on the edge of the forest, is a Mormon village. No one has ever discovered the nature of the rites they perform there, for the place is not too easy to come at in winter and spring, being quite isolated. Moreover, strangers are not welcome when they put guards on their chapel when they meet for service. And are they Russians? I suppose so, though round here they call them heathens, Chuvashes, but as far as I know they're Russians. Maybe they're mixed with Chuvashes or Moldvars. And nobody knows how they became Mormons or what they do. It is said that a generation ago some returned emigrant converted them by his preaching, but how much truth there is in that I don't know. He is said to be the father of half the village and a great prophet. It appears that he used to get drunk and beat the girls with a birch until, inspired by the exercise and the sight of blood, he gave vent to remarkable prophecies. But this is all hearsay, and he died before I came to this district. So they're living with this Russian guy called Frumpkin, who's a bit of a sort of like wants to sort the place out. Anyway, they get completely drunk. The priest tells them about the strange people on the step. And John passes out. So he talks here. It's just like everything you find in this book is in these little conversations. Our peasants are dark and cruel and sensual, but they are strong as the soil they spring from. In springtime the black earth thrusts up violent colour in a night. So it's all this sort of like really poetic sort of language and a lot of talk about Christ. So they get drunk and John leaves the priest. I don't know what happens. They mention here storming heaven. Storming heaven. The priest was musing, the bottles were emptying, and their spirits were low. Storming heaven, he murmured. Storming heaven. In a book by Lenin. I read that thus Karl Marx wrote of the communards in 1871. So they've had enough to drink. John passes out. When he comes to, he gets a horse out of the stables and goes riding off and finds himself at the village, the Mormon village. And he's really sort of like quite taken aback by the silence in the village. Nobody's about, nobody there, he doesn't know what to do, he was sober. And then he came to a big house and he heard a sound. The first that made him freeze to the earth, terror-stricken. It was the voice of a man demented, praying and calling on the universe, on God, but in a voice of horror, a voice that mingled beauty with obscenity, prayer with curses. It ceased, and as he blotted himself into the shadow, he heard a heavy tread as a man came to the door, opened it and stood for a moment in the light of the moon. The man was a giant, 2 wild eyes piercing through the grey-black beard which covered his face, and in his lips were still moving, not quietly but bitterly and in torment. So John scarpers and hides in the church. So he hides up on the beams of the church. So they all come in. All these people start to come in. The silence did not last long. It was weirdly broken by a great chanting that rose through the village, as though each grim hut had come to sudden life. The hymn seemed to merge and grow stronger, no doubt because the people had come into the street, and then he heard the slow shuffle of many feet as the singing approached. The door was opened and the procession entered, led by the priest, who now wore a white robe reaching to his heels. The men came first, ordinary peasants. But in the moonlight they had a grim, unreal appearance, and behind them marched the women. The men formed on the left, the women on the right, and the singing ceased. He looked down. They were on their knees, bowed, strong forms of men and women, gnarled figures of the earth inclined before that wild, bearded giant in his ridiculous white robe. This guy's a giant. John wanted to laugh, but it was an instinct of fear, for the expression on the man's face was terrible. Once again his lips were moving silently, as though in anguish and torment. Then all at once he began to speak, a strange speech, half biblical, half full of the poetry of the seasons, of the seed-time, the ploughing, the bursting up of the young plants, the harvest, of the fruitfulness of the beasts, the bounty of the field, and half his speech was pure poetry and the other half obscenity, such as John had heard him on the threshold. He finished, and there came a sigh from his hearers as of expectancy. And suddenly from outside there was singing which clutched at John's heart, the singing of young girls. The door opened and they entered, 4 girls surrounding a 5th in a white robe similar to the priest's. The people rose to their feet, chanting a great chorus. The priest trembled violently. He seemed to be choking. His hands moved up to his throat uneasily, as though to tear his shirt open. The rest John saw, as through in a dream. A slim white body laid on that black-draped altar, the priest tearing off his robe with a half-strangled cry like a beast's, his hairy giant's body trembling like a leaf, the singing, beating up in frenzy to the roof, mingled with sobs and cries, and a deathly silence that fell on them all when it was over, broken here and there by a murmur, a half-stifled cry. So, John has just witnessed some sort of like ritual ceremony of a girl. Of course, he goes back home and tells them, and I think they go out and get him. They go out, they go over and they get them. But they find the priest crucified. They find that the priest has been, when they get there, they find that they've crucified the priest. So, I mean, they don't say at the beginning of the book he's got a vivid imagination. They say this is a book of exceedingly interesting adventures. So did this guy actually witness this and puts it into a novel? Or he knew of it and put it into a novel because that's what us writers do. Interesting, isn't it? So what I'm going to do is I'll probably read the book properly, because he wrote it when he was a young man, and it's quite obvious that he was a bit of a lusty young man. There are lots and lots and lots of references to doughy eyes and sensual curves and good-looking women, but there's also bits about women dressing up as men to get into villages, and he's travelling with these European women who are trying to convert, I think they're Quakers, are trying to convert the local peasants, and the peasant women are doing things for them in return for stuff, you know. And I think it's quite interesting, and I thought you might be interested in that little passage. So I'm going to do a bit of a screen capture now to have a look at this guy, this Ralph Fox, and find out a little bit about him, yeah? Right, so here's our guy, Ralph Fox, or Rafe Fox, however they pronounce it. So he was born in March 30th, 1900 in Nova Scotia, and he died in 1937. So he was only 37 when he died. He died in the Spanish Civil War. He graduated from Oxford University in 1918, and he first visited the Soviet Union in 1920. So this book was written in 1928, wasn't it? And from 1930 to 32 he worked at the Marx Engels Lenin Institute in Moscow. He died in action while serving as an assistant political commissioner of the Anglo-Irish Brigade of the International Legion during the National Revolutionary War of the Spanish people. So he was a communist. Writing from a Marxist point of view, Fox dealt with contemporary problems in his critical works on literature and history, which included articles on J. Galsworthy and H.G. Wells, and the works Lenin, a Biography, and the Class Struggle in Britain and Portugal Now. So his article in defence of communism, a reply to Harold Lasky, helped propagandise Marxism-Leninism in Great Britain and criticise the reformist views of Labour Party ideologists. This is all stuff that I have never had any interest before, ever in my life, and now I'm reading about this stuff. It's like everything is a learning curve. So he wrote with great conviction on the exhaustion of contemporary bourgeois culture and the prospects of the arts developing in the vein of socialist realism. Right, socialist realism. What is socialist realism? Did I save one of them? I don't think I did. Let's see if I can get this to work today. It's been working alright this morning, so I'm giving it a go. When it gets really slow, my voice slows. But it seems to be like keeping itself together. We'll just look at Wiki's one for now. It's a style of idealised, realistic art that developed in the Soviet Union and was imposed as the official style of that country between 1932 and 1988. So socialist realism is like those sculptures you get of people like being like very sort of like working and it's like art for the people. Yeah. Let's close that. Go back to Ralph. Fox summed up his views in Novel and the People, great socially. As a critic and fiction writer, for example, in his collection of sketches and stories, People of the Steppes, and his novel, Storming Heaven, he persistently warned against the use of socialist realism in a narrow and purely political manner. Fox, however, overestimated the importance of 18th century literature and underestimated the critical realism of the 19th century. Now, I did have a look at that. Bhaskara's theory of critical realism. Critical realism is a philosophical theory of reality and human knowledge. Critical realism posits that humans are capable of learning objectively about the world without interference from human psychology or other subjective factors that colour perception. However, critical realists do not think this is a simple thing to do. To see the world as it really is, one must learn and then reflect critically on what was learned, on how it was coloured by the limits of human perception. That's sort of where we are, isn't it? So it came about as a response by German philosophers to idealist philosophy popular in the 1800s. Oh, God, has my brain got enough room for all this? And like many Marxist literary scholars of the 1930s, he attached undue importance to vulgar sociologism. God, found that as well. Vulgar sociology, a dogmatic simplification of the Marxist method found mainly in the fields of history, art criticism, and the theory of art, literature, and other forms of social consciousness. In a broader sense, vulgar sociologism represents an abstract understanding of Marxism, leading to a loss of its genuine abundance as well as to false political conclusions, a caricature. So it's been used since the 1930s, but the phenomenon itself was known much earlier. So, with regard to ideology, vulgar socialism was a general breeding ground for various left-wing movements which rejected the heritage of the old culture, from the advocacy of the abolition of museums to the theory of dissolving art in production and in life itself. Thus it was considered almost as evident that the trends in painting most in keeping with the proletariat were the so-called organised forms that proceeded from Cubism. This is really interesting. You know, this is the stuff you don't learn. This is how things change and develop. I mean, it's all been given these like jargon, gobbledygook words, but... And now I'm going to have a look at Introduction to Russian Mormonism. So this site houses research on the so-called... This is scottcorner.org. I'm going to link all this stuff if you're interested in it afterwards. This site houses research on the so-called Russian Mormons or Samara Mormons,
a 19th century Christian sect originating in the Vulgar region of the Russian Empire. Although they are unrelated to the more well-known American Mormon movement, the name Mormon has survived in folk Russian religion and been applied to various groups throughout time. So they're not necessarily the same sect as the American or Western civilization's Mormons. So the Mormon Church began activities in Russia during the early 1990s. Reports soon came in that native Mormon communities also existed. The first, Realism, began in the mid-1600s as a mystical, peasant-based sect focusing on living revelation and liberal views regarding marriage and family. The second, Moloch, grew out of the Kailists and spread as a Bible-based religion with a more traditional way of life, abandoning some mystical Kailist elements, such as spiritual marriage, but preserving the tradition of visionary prophets and apostles. So the first group to be called Mormons developed in the Novozensk region situated between present-day Kazakhstan and the Volga city of Saratov. In 1855, a charismatic Molokan named Ivan Grigoriev Kanyigin began gathering followers to a new faith. He incorporated his early ideas of communal property with a less restrictive lifestyle of the Kailists, forming several communes. And it says here, this is about the other lot. The first Samara Mormon groups appeared in the 1870s, and by the mid-1890s had become a powerful religious and social influence in many villages. Unlike Grigorov's Methodists, this northern sect's members were popularly known as Mormons. Some of their leaders practiced polygamy. The Samara Mormons were organised into tight social units based on communal cooperation and led sober lives free of alcohol or tobacco. Each Mormon community was governed by apostles and prophets, with most groups recognising a central Christ figure as the highest religious authority of the sect. Because the Mormons incorporated both the charismatic worship services of the Kailists and the rationalistic approach to religion fostered by the Molokans, the sect had great success among other sectarians and their orthodox religions. By the early 1900s, more than 40 villages contained members of the Mormon sect. However, two factors eventually led to the demise of most Mormon village communities. So, the Bolshevik Revolution finished it off, and the Soviet policy of collectivization tore again apart the ages-old fabric of Russian village life, dislocating established families. Famine, deportation and organised assassinations depopulated most Mormon centres, and those that were left assimilated into secular village life. So maybe he did witness it. Maybe he did witness this sort of like charismatic cult, more men, not necessarily Mormons from the same Latter-day Saints bunch, and wrote about them. But I want to get hold of his book, People of the Steppes, because that one is anecdotes and real life tales, but maybe he embellished it, maybe it was propaganda, I don't know, but I found it interesting, and thanks for watching.